Hey everybody, this is Erica, the technology nerd, likes to film stuff, and right here I have the Nexus 6P. So I did my first impressions and then I wanted to move into the review. As you can see, we don't have much time left before the end of the year. And in interest of time, I want to make more of a compact review, more of a specialized review on this phone. So I did a poll and I saw what you guys really are most interested in. That would be performance, that would be display, that would be cameras, and battery life. So I want to talk about those things with this device so I have a chance to move on to a couple of other things before the end of the year, including a top 5 video of my top 5 favorite smartphones of the year and why. We already know that this is a Nexus phone. We already know that this is going to get a lot of updates. You guys have already seen that the fingerprint sensor on the back is pretty awesome, that a lot of people are really liking it, including myself. It took me a little bit of time. So let's just talk about those more specialized things, and hopefully alone that can help you decide if this is the device for you. So let's go ahead and check that out. So the first thing that I want to do right now is to talk about specs and performance. So we have the Snapdragon 810 SoC inside of this, version 2.1. We have an 8-core CPU. We have 4 lower powered cores that are clocked at 1.56 gigahertz. Those are the A53s. Then 4 higher powered cores, the A57s, that are clocked at 1.96 gigahertz. We have the Adreno 430 GPU, we have 3 gigabytes of RAM, and we have 32, 64, or 128 gigabyte configurations. Unfortunately, we don't have an SD card slot, so you need to choose wisely. I would say that the 64 gigabyte option is the sweet spot. Right out of the gate, I want to say that I have not noticed this overheating. I know that the Snapdragon 810 SoC has gotten a really bad reputation, but I've been able to play with this long and hard, and I have not seen it overheat or really have any issues. We will get a little bit more into that, but just to let you know. Now on this device, we have Android version 6.0.1. This is Marshmallow. And from what I can see from the interface, it's been really nice and smooth. I really haven't had any issues with performance whatsoever around the interface. Everything feels really nice and snappy. It's just been such a joy to use because of that. Really no problems whatsoever. Feels very, very snappy. One thing to keep in mind though, performance-wise, like last year with the Nexus 6, Marshmallow is encrypted by default. Now gratefully, we're not seeing the decline in storage performance like we were seeing with the Nexus 6 last year. We're opening large applications to quite a long time in comparison to other devices with the same specs. So if you want to compare NAND performance with other top devices like the Galaxy Note 5, you can see that the Note 5 does do quite a bit better, although keep in mind that this has UFS 2.0 storage and also this is not encrypted. Generally though, I really don't see any problems. Most applications open up nice and quickly, unless it's an application like a large game or something. Just say something like Asphalt 8 we can show. Again, keep in mind we have UFS 2.0 storage on this one, so the Galaxy Note 5 is just a better performer overall in terms of loading applications. So this opens up just a couple of seconds faster. So that's done, and it's still loading. And there it goes. So it's not horrific, but it's not the absolute best performance. But the Note 5 is kicking just about all the other phones' butts. Now, if we want to look at performance in a standardized way, of course, we can look at some of the benchmarks for CPU and GPU. We can see that the Nexus 6P scores around somewhere near these guys. I would say that it looks pretty close to the Note 5. Here we have GFX benchmark looking at just some GPU results. You can see that they look pretty similar. This is the on-screen, off-screen, on-screen, off-screen. Then here we have the iPhone's GPU scores. That does a lot better in this particular test. Now benchmarks are nice, but they are synthetic, so they don't tell the entire story. So of course I've played a lot with this device, I've played a lot of different games, and I think that all of them play pretty favorably. I think the performance is pretty good. Of course you do get some throttling after a while. That is typical with all the devices that I have seen though. A pretty reliable way to see how this device is handling frame rates over time or how performance is being sustained is by using an application called Game Bench, where you can actually benchmark applications to see how the frame rates are standing up over time. So here we have Asphalt 8, and here we have the game running for about 10 minutes. Within the first 3 minutes, you can see that we're hitting 30 frames per second pretty reliably. We're falling a little bit here. By the way, these little dips are at the end of each race. And here again, we're resuming another race. And after about 5 minutes, you can see we're starting to get some frame rates that are falling within the 20 frames per second or so. And that continues to happen. But then at 30 minutes, you can really see that rise and fall there of the frame rates. So we do have some throttling patterns, but overall I think that the performance has been okay. Games have been definitely playable, but you do have to expect some throttling here, especially with these mobile devices. Google and Huawei have put some thought into the heat dissipation and the design of this device. So even during all this gameplay, I didn't notice it getting incredibly hot. Now this time I did a benchmark of a benchmark. Here we have the T-Rex battery test so that we could run the same graphic over and over and over again, straight for a half hour, and you can see the throttling patterns between the Galaxy Note 5 and also the Nexus 6P. The biggest thing though is that I'm happy that this doesn't get overly hot. Even after a half hour of testing that T-Rex benchmark, it was just fine. It felt a little bit warm to the touch, but it really was not blistering. Overall, I think the performance is pretty good. This device is really nice and snappy. I don't have really anything to complain about, and I don't think really anyone else is going to either. So now let's move on to the display section of this review. This is a 5.7-inch AMOLED display, Quad HD, over 500 pixels per inch, manufactured by Samsung. For all I know, this could be the same display in the Galaxy Note 5. A very high quality display. Now, since this is an AMOLED display, I really like the ambient display feature, where simply, if you want to see what notifications are on your display, you can pick up the phone, and within a second, or recognizing you picking up the phone, it gives you the time and also whatever notifications are on the screen. Then if you touch it, it brings it into full color. I would call that more of a power-saving mode. So this mode I really like. Now unfortunately this mode can be executed a little bit too easily and sometimes not easily enough, where it won't go off when I want it to. That's probably because this is on a timer. So I'm hoping that they're able to optimize this a little bit because it's a pretty great feature to have. And I think AMOLED really showcases that. There is a really huge thing to point out with this display first and foremost. There are two separate modes. It reminds me of what Samsung does, where you have the ability to control how saturated the panel looks. So initially out of the box, this thing looks super saturated. I have some measurements and it is very oversaturated. Not only is this a wide gamut display, so you can display a very large range of colors, you also have oversaturation as well, and high gamma too. So this just looks insanely saturated. It's almost ridiculously saturated. Thankfully, if you go underneath the developer settings, which you're going to have to activate, you have picture color mode, use sRGB. So if you tick this on, it takes a couple of seconds. Now everything looks a lot more sane. The gamma still is high, but overall I think this mode makes a lot more sense. Anytime I watch movies, this is the mode that I'm going to look at. Anytime I'm going to go out and take pictures and I need to see what I'm actually looking at representative on this display, I will turn this to the sRGB mode. But most people really like the punchy looking colors. Now, if you guys are interested in seeing how the Nexus 6P fares against the Galaxy Note 5 in terms of calibration, I set both displays to their most accurate modes. So I set the Note 5 to the basic mode, and I went and set the Nexus 6P to its sRGB mode, and I think that the calibration methodologies look quite similar. They're calibrated similarly, but they are not the same. If you look at their gamut, or the range of color that they're able to show, it is matching sRGB color space. At least their primary point coordinates look pretty close. The saturations don't look all wonky either. So this is where they look similar. Then if we go and we look at the gamma, you see on both of them, the gamma is too high. The average looks about 2.5 for both of them. Now, when you have a gamma that is too high, not only is it going to make the image a little bit more dim, but it's going to saturate the image as well. So much for being completely accurate. Now here we have the comparison of red, green, and blue balance between all of them and what it should be. And we also have the color temperature and what it should be. Looking at the Galaxy Note 5, it's a little bit warmer than 6,500 Kelvin, which is a neutral colored daylight white. And the Nexus 6P is a little bit cooler than 6,500 Kelvin. So their white points do look a little bit different, but with every AMOLED display that I've seen come out of the factory, I see it's a little bit different with its white point, or how the white looks, whether it looks more bluish or looks a little bit more warm. On the Note 5, it looks a little bit more warm. Where on the Nexus 6P, I see a little bit too much green in there. But to my eyes, overall, it really doesn't look bad to me. The thing that really irks me is in the standard mode on the Nexus 6P with just how saturated it is. It's going to make skin tones look really too red. So your best bet is to use the sRGB mode on the Nexus 6P, although a lot of people are not going to even know that it exists. Of course, since it's AMOLED, it has a really great contrast ratio, very nice dark blacks, and it also gets pretty bright. At 100% brightness here, it's getting to be almost 400 nits, where my Note 5 is over 400 nits. I do wish that in the dark I could get the Nexus 6P to be a little bit darker like the Galaxy Note 5. The Note 5 gets really nice and dark. I can turn the Note 5 brightness down to get really nice and dark, so if I'm reading in the dark, it doesn't hurt my eyes. Still, both of these are really top displays. Now, one thing you really need to look out for with the Nexus 6P is burn-in. You can see on the Galaxy Note 5 that we have the navigational buttons on the bezel where they're on the display, always on the Nexus 6P. So if you're not careful, after a while you start seeing these shapes burn into the display. For me, this always happens more quickly than for other people. I use my devices a lot for testing. One thing you really should get is this application. This is called GMD Immersive. And with GMD Immersive, you're able to hide the buttons here. You can either hide everything. In this case, you can see, there you are. Or you can just hide the bottom navigation buttons so they only appear when you swipe upward from the bottom. Or you can have them always present because sometimes applications misbehave if you have this mode activated, or sometimes the keyboard doesn't show up unless you swipe up from the bottom. Sometimes I get annoyed and I will just turn it off by hitting here. Most of the time though, I like to keep them hidden. There you go. You can see that it is now hidden. I don't have to worry about those navigational buttons being static and burning into my display. I overall do think this is a better panel than what we had last year on the Nexus 6. Some of you are not going to agree with me. That's fine, but if you currently have a Nexus 6, just for the display, I would recommend upgrading to what we have now. Seriously. To me, the quality looks on par with what we have with the Galaxy Note 5. The calibration is a little different, but still this is a really good panel. So now let's move on to talking about battery life. This has got a very large battery inside of this, 3,450 milliamp hours. What's also really nice with Marshmallow is that there is the setting doze. Now this is automatic, built into the system. You don't need to turn it on. That's a misconception some people are having. Automatically, if you just set your phone down and you don't touch it overnight, just sits on the desk, you can't touch it at all. The accelerometer comes into play with this. If it's off and you're not touching it, the battery really should not drain very much at all overnight. So when you pick it up in the morning, if you forgot to charge it, you should still be fine. Now, unfortunately for me, I've seen that there is a bug or something going on. I really haven't been able to see doze kicking in. You can see that my device keeps waking itself up during the night. I don't know if it has to do with Wi-Fi or a rogue app or whatever it is. I don't know. I'm trying to figure it out, but you can see I went to bed with the battery at 80%, and I got up with it at 73%. So it drained 7% overnight. That's not horrible. I've seen some people having it drain a lot more. But it should not be waking itself up overnight, so I don't know what that's doing. But in theory, doze is supposed to work really well. Now as for screen on time, I've not been getting a very impressive screen on time. I don't have really bright display. I usually keep it around half or lower than that because this display does get pretty nice and bright. I'm only able to get 3 to 4 hours of on-screen time. Other people are getting 5 hours or more. With battery life, a lot of things come into play, so it's really hard to gauge how good the battery is. For me, it's been kind of just average. It's going to depend on the brightness of the display. It's going to depend on whether you're on Wi-Fi or LTE. It's going to depend on your service area. It's going to depend on what applications you use, how much you use the camera. There's tons of things that go into this. But my personal usage has become pretty consistent with what I do. And I can say that the battery life on this really isn't all that impressive for me. Now, even though I feel that the battery life has been pretty average, I do like that this does charge fairly quickly. It charges in about 90 minutes. It charges especially quickly in the first 45 minutes. This does not have Quick Charge 2.0, so you're going to need to use Google's included charger. Also, there is no wireless charging, But because it does charge fairly quickly, I don't really have that many complaints. I just really thought that the battery would last longer. But we do have that very big display, that bright, colorful display. So it doesn't surprise me that the battery isn't lasting insanely long. I just hoped it would last longer. What's also really cool is if you take the cable that goes from a USB-C to a USB-C device, if you plug this one first, then plug into the device you want to charge, you can charge another device. So this can be used as a battery bank. That is only with USB-C devices, of course. But I have been able to charge up my OnePlus 2 a little bit with the USB-C cable that it came with. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about in this review is the camera, or actually we have two cameras. There is the 8 megapixel camera on the front, f2.4 lens. Then on the back is the main 12.3 megapixel camera, f2.0 lens. Unfortunately, there is no optical image stabilization, but we do have laser assist autofocus. So we have the IR laser here. We have a dual tone flash. Also, this visor that we have here is Gorilla Glass 4. So this camera does not have optical image stabilization, but Google has been banking on the larger 1.55 micron pixels to let in more light. I still think it's a mistake to not have optical image stabilization. It does show at times, especially during video. Also, what's a bummer during video is that this does not take stereo. The audio quality is mono. It's not bad though, at least. If we take a look at the camera interface, it's very, very simple. We have an option here for photosphere, panorama, lens blur. We've got some settings. So you can choose your resolution and the quality. Interestingly, this is a 4:3 aspect lens. This is 12.3. They call it 12.2 megapixels. I'm not exactly sure why that is. So if you want a 16:9 picture, unfortunately you have to drop down to 8.3 megapixels. So that's kind of a bummer for me. I noticed while going out and taking pictures, I really wanted to have that 16:9 aspect. So keep that in mind. You're only going to get the full resolution of the sensor if you keep it at 4:3 aspect. You've got some choices as well for the front camera. For the back camera, we have a couple settings. You have Ultra HD 4K. You've got 1080p at 30 frames per second. No 60 frames per second, unfortunately. I really wish we had that option. That's what I tend to use the most. And then you also have 720p. So because there is no optical image stabilization when you are shooting in 4K, you're left with no stabilization at all. You do have electronic image stabilization, but that's only going to work for 720p and 1080p. So 4K has looked quite shaky to me. And here we have video stabilization enabled. So that's going to work for 1080p or 720p, and it's going to crop the image a little bit. It will show you some samples in just a little bit. So here you have the option for a timer. You have HDR+. I'm going to show samples of that. Also your options for the flash. You can switch to video as well, and you have some options right here. So you can shoot at 120 frames per second or 240 frames per second. Both of these are going to be 720p. Here you have your flash option. You can switch to the front camera. What's really cool about the front camera is that you can also use HDR. Of course, the largest bummer to me about this application is that we don't have any manual controls, although of course you can go and download yourself another camera application. So now let's show some image and video samples, shall we? So in my experience of going out and taking pictures, I've noticed the images usually come out nice and sharp, but sometimes not as detailed as other cameras that have a 16 megapixel sensor, for example, although megapixels are not everything, I know this. Still images do have a good bit of detail. I often like the colors, the color processing. I find them to be quite pleasing to the eye, usually, although not always, but I notice that sometimes the images look a bit dark or underexposed. Interestingly, using the HDR+ setting makes the images look even darker. And I have noticed this on several occasions. It wasn't just a fluke. I tend to see that quite often when I use the HDR+ setting, the images come out darker than without it. But still, the HDR+ setting does indeed recover highlights. This is the best that Google has done so far, and I do give them props. Then looking at the low-light images, they can be decent, but I've noticed that sometimes they tend to be noisy, washed out, just kind of a mess unless you use the HDR+ setting, and then that's a whole different story. I find this to be a little bit upsetting because Google brags about how you can take good pictures in any lighting. This is where I really think it could benefit from optical image stabilization, especially with those large pixels. The shutter could stay open longer with lower ISO, so you have less noisy images. So I've mentioned that images can come out a little bit dark or underexposed. You'd think no problem, just go and get another camera app because you don't have the ability inside of the stock app. But weirdly, right now, if you try to use exposure compensation, it's just not working. So that's a bug or something going on. I've heard that this was a problem before. You see, the exposure is simply not changing when I'm messing around with the exposure compensation. So that's not really an option right now. If I found an image to be a little bit too dark, I'd probably just boost the exposure compensation a little bit and try to help that. But you just can't do that right now. So I will keep my eye open for this. Now this doesn't have optical image stabilization at all. Here I am again talking to the camera on the Nexus 6P. Now this is 1080p, 30 frames per second, and trying to see if this has at least digital image stabilization. I don't know if 4K does. I have to check quality on that. Just walking in a beautiful nature preserve. I know I'm weird. Let's see how it transitions with exposure, looking at the sky. Now going downward. There you go. Still talking to the Nexus 6P. I can actually see that little laser for the laser autofocus pointing at me. No optical image stabilization. So I don't know how much of a problem that will be. Here we have 4K. Or Ultra HD if you want to get super technical. Pretty. This is where I really should get a tripod for this type of thing. I must look really young or something because I was stopped as I was taking pictures for my review. Someone asked me if I was taking pictures for my photography class or something for high school, and I said yes. I didn't feel like explaining, so strange. There we go, 4K, 30 frames per second on the Nexus 6P. So overall, I think that the camera is pretty good. I think it can produce some really nice images, although I really do think that it suffers from not having optical image stabilization. I know Google has tried to get around this and promote around this, but I've been able to make my own points here. Also, their application needs manual controls, and they really do need to fix the exposure compensation issue. Although this is a Nexus device, so we will be getting timely and speedy updates. So I'm overall not too worried, and I'll be curious to see if the camera improves in the future. So thank you everybody for watching. This has been Erica, the technology nerd who likes to film stuff. Please rate, comment, and subscribe. So I've covered some major things here. These are ones that you guys seem to care about most. As a wrap-up, this is a very nice performing device. This is a Nexus, so we're going to be getting speedy and timely updates. This is a very smooth, pure Android experience that I love. It's got a really great display, and you have some options if you do not like the oversaturated appearance. You've got decent battery life, you do have fast charging, and we have a little bit of future-proofing here with USB-C. And the camera overall is pretty good. It really is pretty good. It's not the absolute best camera or feature pack camera out there, but it does do the job, and I'd be pretty confident using this on a daily basis, at least from what I've seen so far. So again, everybody, thank you for watching. Leave your comments in the comment section below. Let me know what you think if you have this already and if you share my experiences or not. And have a good night.